Hello and welcome to another Manor Lord's Guide. In this video, we'll be covering all of the essentials for starting a new town. This will include information and tips for a starting building order, fulfilling the initial set of residential requirements, and setting up your town for successful growth. This is a bit of a popular topic, and I know that there are already a decent amount of other startup guides out there. But as always, there are different approaches, and I like to help you out with straightforward and helpful information, so hopefully this can still provide some value to you. So the first step before anything else is to take a look at your region to see what resources are available and then see where your starting camp is in relation to that. Before you start placing buildings, take a moment to think about how you'll lay things out. The short-term priority is to get an initial infrastructure set up for survival, which is easiest to do if you stay close to the starting camp. If you try to settle too far away from here, it can cause a domino effect of delays in getting established, which can really make things harder. But you also want to think about the long-term growth of your town to a certain extent as well. And settling somewhere that's in close proximity to essential resources can make a very noticeable difference, especially as things start to ramp up. And at that point, it can be difficult to move a lot of what you've already established. So picking where you'll start your town is the first important decision that you'll have to make. Once you've decided on a location, the first set of tasks to complete are gathering building materials, storing exposed supplies, and preparing all the initial residential approval demands. Here's a quick reminder of what those initial requirements are. Food, firewood, and clothing stocked at the marketplace, as well as access to water and a church. Having to quickly prepare all of these requirements early on can sound like a lot, but we'll simplify things with a straightforward strategy to easily cover everything here. You'll have more leeway with the building order if you're playing on the default or relaxing settings. But if you're playing on challenging, there's a lot more to think about with the initial setup. This approach is tailored to work well on any difficulty setting, so you won't have to worry about losing supplies, dropping approval, or missing any other necessary steps. So now let's dive into the main order of operations. Start by placing a logging camp. Try to place this in a location that's close to trees and your projected town area. Everything requires logs early on, so getting these under production as soon as possible is key. I also highly recommend placing another hitching post right next to this logging camp and ordering a second ox right away. This will really help speed up the process of harvesting logs, producing planks, and getting all of your initial construction projects done. This will in turn speed up the process of getting your approval high enough for new families to move in. And speaking of planks, the second thing that we need for our initial building materials is a saw pit. Place this right next to your logging camp so they don't have to travel too far for the materials. You'll need to get some planks produced pretty quickly to construct some of the upcoming buildings such as the tannery and the church. Try to keep at least one family unassigned throughout the majority of this process because they'll be needed for moving logs either to construction sites or to the saw pit constantly. So after you've got that done, as you may have guessed, the next priority is getting storage buildings set up. Since you typically start in spring, rain will show up pretty soon, which could destroy your initial supplies if you do not get them safely stored beforehand. This will set you behind on food and firewood. So you'll need to place a granary and a storehouse, ideally in locations that are close to wherever you are producing those supplies and wherever you plan on putting your marketplace. Once they're constructed, temporarily staff these storage buildings so they'll store the exposed supplies. But after that, free them up for other tasks again until we're ready to stock the marketplace. So next up is food and clothing. Assuming that you have at least a regular hunting area available somewhere in your region, place down a hunting camp. This building has zero construction costs, and a quick bit of early hunting can get you started on food and clothing supply. If you have access to another food supply such as a berry or fishing deposit, now would be a good time to set up the gathering buildings for these resources as well. Your peasants will consume food even before they move into houses or have access to a market stall, so make sure that you keep enough stored for at least a couple of months. You'll then need a tannery to convert the hides into leather, and this will cover your initial clothing supply. I recommend staffing the hunting camp and the tannery just enough to produce 5 or 6 leather to cover your initial set of housing and then free them up for other tasks until later. This will cover the clothing for your initial families and will not need to be replenished, so you can easily come back to this and produce more leather once you start getting new families moving in. Firewood is the other main resource that we'll need to supply for our initial residential demands, but unlike food, this does not get consumed until houses are occupied. So the firewood that you get in the starting supplies will be good for a couple of months. You can go ahead and place a firewood cutter, but I wouldn't worry about staffing it until after you've got everything else set up. I won't get too much into the specifics of town logistics, marketplace operation, economy, etc. in this video, but I have more guides here on my channel which talk about all of this information in more detail, so feel free to check that out. So at this point, you should have the infrastructure for at least a starting supply of all the initial resource demands. There's only a couple of things left to do before we can start building houses and growing the town. Before creating a marketplace and staffing up the storage buildings again, you'll want to build the church. This requires a bit of labor because there are a lot of building materials that will need to be transported to the construction site. So try to place it near your building supplies, but also in an area that's easily accessible because your workers will periodically go here to pray. I recommend trying to have at least 2 or 3 families unassigned for this task, otherwise it can take a really long time to complete the construction. Once this is done, we're ready to start setting up our residential area. So go ahead and place a marketplace, a water well, and then plot down the first 5 houses for your initial 5 families. From this point onward, you'll need to keep the storehouse and granary staffed pretty much full time for marketplace distribution. So this is why it's good that we completed a lot of labor-intensive tasks already before this point. From here, you'll start getting into positive approval very soon, and you can really start growing your town. Don't forget to place additional housing before the start of each new month once you're ready for new families to start moving in. And while you're going through this process, make sure to rotate your current families around to different gathering jobs to keep up with your marketplace supplies. The next priority would be to establish some economy, so go ahead and place a trading post and start selling small amounts of whatever you can. Planks, for example, are a great thing to sell for some reasonable income early on. This is also a good time to place any additional resource gathering buildings if you have access to raw materials such as iron, clay, or salt, for example. And soon after all this, you should be ready to build your manor. Your starting supplies include 20 stone, which gets used for constructing the granary in the church, so you'll need to place a stonecutter camp in order to get the materials needed for the manor. And similar to constructing the church, the manor also requires a lot of building materials, so having some extra families unassigned for this task can help speed up the construction. Then you'll be able to start taxing some of your regional income from trade and start producing some treasury wealth. So that concludes the initial town setup. When you're getting started, these can be among some of the hardest parts of the game. The biggest factor here, which gets easier with practice, is micromanaging your workforce, especially when they are limited in number early on. Just try to make sure that you don't have families assigned to a workplace that isn't necessary at that moment. By following these simple steps, your town will easily be ready for the next stages. Before we wrap up the video, I have a couple of extra tips and information. I want to briefly explain one of the key parts of the strategy, which is building houses after setting up the initial infrastructure buildings. The reason is that as soon as your peasants move into a house, they immediately activate all of their residential approval demands. And if you don't already have them all covered, your approval rating will quickly decline. You will of course lose some approval from them being homeless until you build houses for them, but the approval loss from the one category of homelessness is far less of a hit compared to all of the categories from the residential demands. You of course do want to get them into houses as soon as possible because they only start with 2 family members, but they will gain a third when they move into a house, which will increase your workforce. But doing this prematurely can really set you back on the timeline of getting your approval above 50% for new families to start moving in, which will vastly outweigh the temporary gain of a third family member. Once again, this is mainly a concern if you're playing on the challenging settings, but it's still good practice regardless. And to piggyback on this, keep in mind that upgrading houses basically follows the same concept. What I mean by this is that as soon as any house gets upgraded, the residing families will immediately increase their approval requirements to the next tier. In this case, for example, upgrading from level 1 housing to level 2 will add a third food variety, a second clothing variety, an upgraded church, and a steady supply of ale to their list of demands. So you can avoid significant approval loss here by planning ahead for providing these demands before upgrading the houses, just like we did for the first set of demands. As always, there are various approaches with starting strategies, and ultimately the best one is whatever works for you. So I hope this information helps you set up some successful new towns. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or questions, and check out more Manor Lords guides here on my channel if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Peace.